To satisfy the labor needs of rapidly growing American colonies, European settlers turned in the early 17th century from indentured servants, who were mostly poor Europeans, to a cheaper, more plentiful labor source: enslaved Africans. After 1619, when a Dutch ship brought 20 Africans ashore at the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, slavery spread quickly through the American colonies. From the 16th to the 19th century, between 10 million and 12 million enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas to work as enslaved labor. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about one of the most abhorrent practices in modern times: the practice of slavery. Looking back through history, ancient Greece could be argued to be the world's first true slave society, where the majority of the economy was dependent on slave labor. Slaves made up about a third of the total population, with the wealthier classes viewing manual labor with disdain. But ancient Greece did offer a way out of slavery, whereby the slaves could buy their freedom or were freed at their master's discretion. It wasn't total freedom, because they were never legally allowed to become full citizens, and the majority were still obligated to provide some duties to their former masters. But there was some evidence of the ethics of slavery being questioned, with some arguing that slavery was incompatible with the humanity's creation in the image of God. As traditional slavery declined, we see an emergence of serfdom in the British Isles and in feudal Europe during the medieval times. Serfs were different to the previous definition of slaves, as they were not classed as property and were entitled to protection and justice. However, they did not have free movement, and they had a debt bondage to their lord, and they were legally tied to the land. They were forbidden to move without consent, and in return for shelter, they were required to pay tribute in the form of cash or labor. If they grew their own corn, they were legally obliged to pay the lord to use the mill he owned to grind it. Serfdom continued for a few centuries until the Black Death bubonic plague in the 14th century. The bubonic plague led to reduced population and a high demand for workers, and all of a sudden, the serfs found themselves in a position where they could negotiate for their freedom as well as their wages. But in some places like Eastern Europe and Russia, serfdom survived all the way until the 19th century. Modern era slavery, though, has an overlap with colonization. The European slave trade began with Portugal's exploration of the west coast of Africa in search of a sea trade route to the east. The east had bountiful new resources like spices and silk, and the Portuguese were eager to acquire these goods without the laborious journey by land from Europe to Asia. In 1482, the Portuguese traders built Elmina Castle in the present-day Ghana on the west coast of Africa. Originally, this was built as a fortified trading post. It was used for trading gold, and it had mounted cannons facing out to sea to ward off a naval attack from other European nations. But by the 16th century, the Portuguese had shifted their focus to trading enslaved people, because the demand for slave labor had ballooned in the New World. The term New World at that time was used to depict North and South America collectively. So the Elmina Castle morphed into a holding pen for Africans from the interior of the continent. On the upper floors, the Portuguese traders ate, slept, and prayed, whereas the enslaved people in the dungeon stayed for weeks or months until ships arrived to transport them to Europe or to the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade was one leg of a three-part system known as the triangular trade. The forming of the triangle began when European ships carrying firearms and manufactured goods sailed to Africa. Here, the commodities were traded for enslaved men, women, and children. And next, the same ships transported the human cargo across the Atlantic to the Americas. This journey, called the Middle Passage, was complete when the ships, having disembarked the enslaved Africans, were reloaded with cotton, sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops produced by the slave labor. And these commodities, the cotton, sugar, and tobacco, were then delivered to Europe. The countries that enslaved the highest number of Africans, from the most to the least, were Portugal, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, the United States, and Denmark. Now, the conditions in the slaver ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean were brutal and deadly. These ships were specifically designed for maximizing the number of men, women, and children that the slave trading captains and their crews could bring to the Americas. Once on board, the crew members segregated the enslaved Africans by gender and then chained and packed them closely together in ship holds. It is said that these men were packed so close together that sometimes even lighting a match in that section was not possible because of lack of oxygen. So it should be no surprise that about 13 to 19% of Africans on these ships died during the Middle Passage. Cotton, sugar, and tobacco, the three crops that drove the demand for slave labor in the Americas. Before cotton dominated American agriculture, sugar drove the slave trade throughout the Caribbean and the Spanish Americas. Sugarcane was a brutal crop, and it required constant work 6 days a week. As a result, the lifespan of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation was as little as 7 years. But the plantation owners were unfazed and worked their laborers to death and prepared for this high turnover by ensuring that new batches of enslaved people continued to arrive on a regular basis. So what drove the transatlantic slave trade? Was it racism, or was it pure supply and demand economics? The demand for sugar and tobacco mandated an equal supply of labor for these crops. Spaniards and Portuguese did not want to work in the fields. They wanted to own the fields. European diseases had wiped out the indigenous populations, and conversion to Christianity had made some indigenous people exempt from certain types of forced labor. As a result, Europeans looked to Africa for a new source of workers. Africans were deemed suitable for work in the Americas because they were unfamiliar with the land, so less likely to escape. And most important, largely resistant to European diseases. And to add to that, very accustomed to laboring and farming in the tropics. Now, like in other parts of the world, African elites had engaged their armies in warfare with neighboring people. Since the demand for slave labor in Africa was a profitable business, the wars within Africa started also increasing. one empire within Africa would defeat its rivals and then profit from the spoils of that victory by selling their captives into slavery. And as I mentioned earlier, in return for supplying slaves, the African elites were paid with a variety of manufactured products, including guns, cotton textiles, glass, and food products made from the very sugar that was grown by the slaves in the Americas. The most devastating effect of slave trade was on the African economy itself. Young men and women who would have been the backbone of the African farming and industrial labor force were no longer available to the continent itself. Missing people led to the missing productivity, which led to dissatisfaction, violence, instability, and finally to the militarization of the society. The slave trade also changed the political configuration in that the administrative class was replaced by a warrior class whose sole purpose was the capture of slaves. As a result of this, Africa was not able to keep up with the other economies and therefore was not in a position to extend its markets to international business. The sad irony was that it was Africa who helped develop Western states by providing the human labor. And this happened at the cost of Africa's own development. Now, among the Americas, within the United States, the demand for slave labor started with the tobacco industry, which later gave way to the cotton industry. Many northern states had abolished slavery by the end of the 18th century. But the institution was absolutely vital to the South. The slave labor constituted a large minority of the population, and the economy relied on the production of crops like tobacco and cotton. Congress outlawed the import of new enslaved people in 1808, but enslaved population in the US nearly tripled over the next 50 years, and by 1860, it had reached nearly 4 million, with more than half living in the cotton-producing states of the South. In August of 1791, a major event happened that would give hope and motivation of emancipation to slave labor across the globe. In the French colony of Haiti, self-liberated slaves rose against French colonial rule, and by 1804, the colony had become independent. The slave owners in the South became nervous, and subsequently, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793, which made it a federal crime to assist an enslaved person trying to escape. But the word had spread, and a group emerged that made it their objective to free enslaved people from the South and get them over to the North. They were the Quakers, and what was established was the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was really a network of people, African American as well as white, who were offering shelter and aid to escaped enslaved people from the South. And it operated from the late 18th century up to the Civil War. Now, how the Underground Railroad worked was that people known as conductors guided the fugitive enslaved people, and they were hiding places like private homes, churches, and schoolhouses. These were called stations, safe houses, and depots, and the people operating them were called station masters, hence the name railroad. There were many well-used routes stretching west through Ohio to Indiana and Iowa, and others headed north through Pennsylvania and into New England, or through Detroit on their way to Canada. And one of the most famous conductors for the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. But why escape to Canada? Wasn't escaping to the northern states safe enough? Well, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which allowed the local governments to apprehend and extradite escaped enslaved people, was the problem. And even though some northern states had tried to combat this with personal liberty laws, but these were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1842. So escaping to the northern states was still fraught with risk. And Canada, on the other hand, offered freedom to people of color, and they could live wherever they wanted, sit on juries, run for public office, and even more. And the efforts at extradition had largely failed. And as a result, some Underground Railroad operators based themselves in Canada to help arriving fugitives settle in. So with the Underground Railroad being successful to some extent, the voices and forces against slavery became more prominent and vocal. And all of a sudden, slaves also started standing up and revolting against their masters. The slave owners in the South became paranoid that the northern anti-slavery abolitionists would go to any lengths to destroy the institution of slavery. Rumors spread that there were many planned insurrections against the slave owners, and the South reverted to a semi-war status. And then, in 1860, the anti-slavery Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president. And immediately in the spring of 1861, the bitter conflicts that had been intensifying between the North and the South over the course of 4 decades erupted into civil war. 11 southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln's foremost target, though, during the war was to preserve the Union. But by the summer of 1862, Lincoln also realized that he could not avoid the slavery question much longer, and 5 days after the Union victory in September, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And on January 1, 1863, the proclamation was made official that enslaved people within any state or designated part of a state in rebellion shall be thenceforward and forever free. Slavery was finally abolished in America. About 4 million enslaved people won their freedom along with the Union victory in the Civil War. But significant challenges awaited the newly freed population. The 13th Amendment was adopted in 1865, and that officially abolished slavery. But the question of the freed people's status in the post-war South remained. And as white Southerners gradually re-established civil authority in the former Confederate states in 1865 and 66, they enacted a series of laws known as the Black Codes, which were designed to restrict the freed people's activity and ensure their availability as a labor force. But in 1868, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which broadened the definition of citizenship, granting equal protection of the Constitution to the people who had been enslaved. But despite all these laws, the fight for equality and civil rights would continue late into the 20th century. But that I'll cover in a subsequent episode. And it is here that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. What is the primary export of Afghanistan? Based on the December 2021 data, carpets and rugs constitute 45% of total exports from Afghanistan, followed by dried fruits at 31%. So the answer is D, carpets and rugs. Question for the current episode. What was the last country to abolish slavery? Was it A, Mauritania, B, Myanmar, C, Saudi Arabia, or D, Oman? Once again, what was the last country to abolish slavery? A, Mauritania, B, Myanmar, C, Saudi Arabia, or D, Oman? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we travel to 1967 to witness a defining moment in the history of the Middle East. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.